So welcome back. I was just there. So, so the relationship between the church and the state. If this is probably one of the. This is most certainly the most important thing for us to get clear in our heads. Uh, so, the Constantines uh, took the state into the church, and so the state in the the church and state were basically merged. But with the decay of the Roman Empire, you have the situation where it's inverted, where the functions of what the traditionally, if you like, the sword functions of the of the state were then taken into the church, and the church basically used the state to get done what it wanted to get done. Now, the Reformation period, if we jump all the way to the Reformation, now one of the things Martin Luther said was that he said that he took the view that that coercive power that was exercised by the church was completely illegitimate, and so because the church was, people were being accused of heresy or something, and then and anybody the church didn't like, they'd basically pass a death sentence on them. And Martin Luther actually said that. He said that, with a death sentence they solve every problem. And so Luther had a very strong view of where he said that people shouldn't be put to death for heresy. Heresy is something that goes on in the mind and ideas, and it's not something that the people shouldn't be put to death for. So he recognized, and the Reformation in general made that distinction between excuse me a moment. Yeah, turn the heater off. They made this distinction, between a functional distinction between the church and the state. They recognized that they were different, that the and when you get in some of the sorry, I just need to get the right flow here, because this is quite complicated. But but what happened with the Reformation is that very, very quickly, within say 50 years, and part of this was to do with the problem of the Anabaptists and the Radical Reformation, is that because the Reformation challenged the hegemony and the authority of the Catholic Church, and it demonstrated that it was illegitimate. So some of the radical reformers who were associated with the Anabaptist movement, and in some ways there was Luther. Historically, there was like a sequence. There was Luther, Zwingli, who was a Swiss reformer, who was very who developed a very distinctive, if you like, theocratic view of the Reformation as well, of of God's law being in every sphere of life. Very interesting guy, who also believed in fighting for it. He actually died with the sword in his hand in battle, and probably prematurely. It's and then there was Calvin. Now Zwingli had quite an influence on Calvin, of his view. But one of the interesting things about Calvin is that he never explicitly worked out, say, like a theology of the state, and in many ways that was a function of his life, really, in the sense of being the leading light of the Reformation in Geneva. And he had a very it was his relationship with the state was because he was actually evicted from Geneva at one point, but then they brought him back. They invited him back because he was a great social reformer. He was a great political reformer. He was a great spiritual reformer. He was remarkable. That had enormous influence, and John Knox who the Scot, studied with and learned from Calvin, and then took the Reformation back to Scotland, and Calvin was was a remarkable genius in many ways. But one thing he never did was formally work out the relationship between the church and the state. And what actually happened was that in practice, because of the Anabaptist problem of people being because both Luther and Calvin considered that the Anabaptists their views, because they were so extreme, and they started to deny the legitimacy of any state authority at all, and that both Luther and Calvin viewed that as a threat to the Reformation itself, because they would say that because these people were so extreme, the rulers are going to use this as an excuse to attack, to attack the Protestant lands, in the sense, on the lands that were embracing the Reformation. And so they were actually they got to the point where they actually began to persecute the Anabaptists. Actually, I think at one point, Luther sent some troops against one town. He was very affected by the peasants' revolt. He felt that this was going to undermine. So they, by force of the social conditions and the political conditions of the time, rather than because of a rigorous working out of what should the relationship of the church be, in practice, what actually happened was that for both Luther and Calvin, they began to in practice use the same technique of getting the state to act in the interests of the religion, so that they effectively replaced the Catholic hegemony with a Protestant hegemony of actually using the state to further what the church would consider the right thing to do. And this is why there was times where, but now it is more nuanced than this. I think this is important to understand, because they were in an astonishingly difficult environment, that they were dealing with. They were dealing with, with a crazy papal hegemony that wanted to destroy all Protestants, and had launched a counter-Reformation and Inquisition. All this stuff was going on, and so we have to not judge people by. It's easy to look at it in hindsight and say, "Oh, this was an enormous mistake," but you have this. What slowly sort of like evolved from this was that you had those who understood that if you merge the church and the state together, get together like that, then what actually happened was, say in the British situation, you had Henry VIII's famous before in our society, because that was a break. He wanted a divorce. The Catholic Church wouldn't grant him a divorce. He really was trying to. He was basically still a Catholic in his view, but he did invite some of the reformers to preach to him. One of the he did enjoy the preaching of some of the reformers, because some of the reformers would actually say that you as the monarch, you should have jurisdiction over your own land rather than the Pope. It's illegitimate, the Pope. And obviously Henry VIII would like that, because the Pope claimed absolute supreme authority over all, and the individual monarchs were like his vassals. And but what eventually happened was that Henry VIII broke from Rome, but he basically arrogated to himself, and the spiritual leaders of the nation at the time, even though they knew better, actually agreed and allowed Henry to basically replace the papal authority and all the things that the Pope would do. He basically took that position. So he he became the head of the church, as well as the monarch. And this is why in the UK in Britain we say that the monarch is the defender of the faith, and because the defender of the faith was used to be the title that the Pope gave his favoured monarch, and whereas Henry just appropriated it for himself. I think there was a time where he almost reconciled with the Pope, or there was something was happening, and the Pope gave him that honorary title, Defender of the Faith. But even though they later fell out with the Pope, he kept that title. So it wasn't really like so it was, when it said Defender of the Faith, it wasn't really Defender of the Christian faith. It was a Defender of the Catholic hegemony. It's not really an honorary title. It's something that's lost on us now. People say, yes, the Queen was the Defender of the Faith. Well, yes, the Queen was a fine monarch, but she was a fine monarch, and her Christianity was fine, not because it was Catholic. It was because she was just a fine Christian woman. And but that's a bit lost. We think a Defender of the Faith is a good thing, but it wasn't. It was a title bequeathed upon the Pope's favoured monarch. To then go out as Defender of the Faith, he was to kill all the heretics within his land. That was literally what he was supposed to do. The Defender of the Faith was the one who killed all the heretics in the land. So it's not an honorary title. That's another interesting piece of history. But so once Henry had appropriated and arrogated it to himself, when it was allowed to by the spiritual leaders, so the monarch, the political head of state, then also again became the head of the church, and that was okay as long as they were basically aligned. But what happened was, I think Henry's son Edward, he died prematurely. Then he had Mary, and she's called Bloody Mary, because she basically killed in order to try. She wanted to reconcile herself back to Rome, and she did what can only be described as genocide of. She killed something like 10,000 people in one town, and that was, you're talking 600-700 years. That was enormous. That was just like destroying a city, and that's why she was called Bloody Mary, because of all the blood she shed. But she actually basically said to the leaders of the of the church, she basically said, well, you've given me this power, and all I've done is use the power that you've given me, because you've appointed me as head. And so people began to understand that this relationship of church and state, that if they there was an interesting version of this principle by somebody called Erastus, who was he'd studied Zwingli, and he was interesting because he in some ways, even though he was called a follower of Erastus, his view of the church and state was very different. So he actually said that the church's power had no coercive power at all. So only the state had coercive power, and so he actually viewed the state as but he said that the church could speak into the state as and could initiate things for say if there was some sort of reformation, something that needed to happen, the church could initiate something, and say the state should behave in a particular way, but the church couldn't tell the state what to do. But the state, as long it's interesting because this is where sort of like Anglicanism, what we called Anglican, and the Anglican Church, our established church, what's called the established church, a state church in England, and other state churches almost, and we would, in the US, I think it's Episcopalian church, isn't it? And a very, very this sort of idea that there's this. This is why in our it's called the established church, because the bishops of the church the bishops of the church. This is a characteristic of this sort of like idea of there still being this relationship of church and state, and that the church is the one that can consecrate, say, like a bishop, and if you like, present to the state this is who they want to be as a bishop, but the state can veto that person. But the state can't say we want this person to be the bishop, but only the church can consecrate it. So it's meant to be sort of a bit more of a you're seeing that this is church and state almost on an equal footing, whereas before, the church is either dominating the state, or the state is dominating the church. In the time of Constantine, the typical papal view was the church dominating the state, but you then had this sort of like view as something that flowed out of the Reformation. There was this tension, understanding that the church and the state were distinct and that they should be functionally distinct. But it wasn't until in our period, and Presbyterianism sort of pulled the distance. So you had the Puritans. Sorry, I'm not finishing my sentences here. You had within the Anglican Church, you had what were called the Puritans, and the Puritans initially were those who believed that the Reformation had just stalled and hadn't reformed the church enough. And so it's typical, because what happened was, even though you had sort of like the church had broken away from Rome, people were still were in all the vestments of the church. They still basically looked like Catholics, and the doctrine of salvation had been reformed, but the Puritans wanted to push this on into other parts of government, and there was a section of the Puritans who I think it was Roger Cartwright, who was the Regis Professor at Cambridge, I think, who started, who was a Puritan who began what was called the Presbyterian view of, and the Presbyterians very much viewed that they understood that there needed to be a separation of church and state, but they nevertheless still believed that the state should be responsible for things like church discipline. So the church couldn't have anything to do with doctrine, but the church could call on the state, because they recognized the difference. They recognized that they couldn't use coercive authority to kill, to discipline the church, but they could call on the church to, if the church identified to the state that there was immoral behavior going on within the society, the church would call upon the state to deal with this, and that all the laws that the state would pass independently, the church, if you like, could audit, and for for being in line with the with the scriptural principles. So the idea of sort of like but there was still, you can still see how, even in the Presbyterian view, which was, and in the Westminster Confession, the great sort of confessions of and you had before that, you had the Dutch Reformed Church and the Belgic Confession, the Westminster Confession, which are the two big Presbyterian confessions, and there are remarkable documents, amazing confessions, amazingly, full statement of faith. But where they really struggled in the confessions, and I think Lloyd Jones brings this out well as well, is it was saying, when you try and justify scripturally the role that a magistrate, that a church can use a magistrate to impose discipline upon society, or even discipline within the church by this external magistrate who was a member of the state. They one of the distinctives about the Westminster Confession was that they would give all the biblical references for their positions, for the statements. That's why it's such a powerful confession. If you ever read it, it's an amazing piece of of philosophy as well. They really understood some amazing things about human nature and human society, and it's a great piece of, it's not just, these are people putting into practice with the practical implications of what they believe, but they really struggled to try and justify the idea of a magistrate doing the church's bidding, if you like, a secular magistrate who would impose discipline within the church. And I think they only managed one single New Testament reference for that, and that was quite an obscure one of, Lord Joe goes into this. I don't want to spend too much time on that, but other than to show that there was this sort of like view, even the Presbyterian view of, of somehow the state being involved, and the church speaking to the state and requiring the state to deal with ensuring that, where there's been a lack of discipline, and calling on the discipline and to exercise discipline within the church. There was still this relationship between church and state. Now, what really changed and what really happened was that at that time, when Scottish Presbyterians, there was a civil war in Britain. Charles I had been sort of like kicked out. You then had the protectorate of Oliver Cromwell, amazing things that he managed to do. But Charles II, they did sort of schemed an intrigue and somehow managed to convince the Scottish Presbyterians to support his coming back. Those sort of the coming back to be the monarch, and he basically promised that the Presbyterianism would then become, if you like, the Church of England would be reorganized along Presbyterian lines. And so the Presbyterians, so the Scots were allied with him, and brought Charles II back, and brought the monarchy back. And Charles II very quickly turned around and then evicted all the Presbyterians from all and that really changed the consciousness of Presbyterianism with regards, and with if you like, the Reformation view, the post Reformation Protestants changed their view of the relationship between church and state, and people began to argue for complete separation, because the same thing happened when the Puritans went over to the US, to try and escape from religious persecution. They ended up creating new churches, their own churches, but it became tyrannical. In a sense, they exercised the same, and there was the same problem of even though they wanted to create new churches, they still had this problem of they couldn't. It was only until this happened, and Charles II, then you had all the problems with I think maybe it was King George III, and eventually the American Civil War being fought. But there was a change in the consciousness of the believers, who they realized that this idea of giving the only of allowing the state, whenever the state had any type of authority in the church, or whenever you invited the state to be involved, that was going to the state was going to tyrannize and impose upon people a state religion. And that's one of the things when that the episode with Charles, and then that change began to change the consciousness, and people began to call themselves non-conformists and independent, and they argued for a complete, and separatists. And the reason why they were called separatists was because they believed in a complete separation of church and state. So the spheres were completely separate, and that the church had no role. The church wasn't involved directly in government. It couldn't call upon the state to enforce discipline within society, or within to deal with problems of discipline within the church. It couldn't call, the church had to deal with its own issues within its own and the and it wasn't and there was no establishment, so there was no things like bishops weren't given privilege, because like bishops in the UK, bishops sit in the House of Lords. That's the establishment, the established church. So the bishops, because they're appointed by the state, they are political figures as well, and they sit in the House of Lords. Whereas what happened in the US, they realized that, and the response to Charles was that the independence and the people that realized there had to be complete separation. And so and Roger Williams was one of the guys in the US who really took that idea on, because all the problems. So he originally went over to, he started off as a vicar in Boston, in Lincolnshire, which is where and that's why Boston in the UN, Massachusetts, is called Boston, because he went over to, and he went over seeking religious freedom, found that what was happening with the Puritan settlements there and the Covenanters and stuff, that was becoming very restrictive. He found that very restrictive, and it started that people were forced to be, if they wanted to vote, they had to make a declaration of faith or something, and that mean everybody made a declaration of faith, whether they were believers or not believers. And so he realized that there was something deeply unspiritual and unsatisfactory about that. So he'd been moved, because he'd been invited, I think, to be, I don't know, being a governor or a teacher for the colonies or something. And he said that, what's going on here? I can't agree. I'm going to move. So he moved south to Salem or somewhere, I think, and then but he eventually founded the Rhode Island colony, because he was judged by the he eventually got, because there was so much tension between himself and the leaders of the colonies. They'd agreed that he was to be deported back to Britain, but he'd heard about it, and then he went south. He went down to and founded the Rhode Island, founded Providence, founded the Rhode Island state, and argued for a complete religious liberty, complete freedom of consciousness, and a complete separation of church and state. So this remains, I think, so in practice, that's the thing. A lot of the in many respects, the sort of like the history of getting to this point where of understanding that it's not just it doesn't have to be just like a conceptual separation of church and state, understanding that the church is something different and the state is something, because the origin of the church, that's the thing. They are different. That's the thing. They're different because their origin and their purpose and what God institutes for them and their purpose that He's ascribing to them is very, very different. So the church came into existence in the sense, the church just means the gathering of the chosen people of God together. So it talks about the church of the Old Testament. Israel has been given it talks about the church in the desert. So the church is not a new word, but the church really is just the people of God, the gathering of the people of God. And the New Testament church is the people of God gathered from all nations. But there are many churches in many different nations, all with different sort of like characters, all And whereas the state is something which is a negative, coercive view, because one of the problems we have in modern society is the idea that the people consider the state to have lots of positive functions. So the state's got to organize for the common good of everybody, whereas really the biblical state is the view of the state is very negative. It's very small. The purposes and how it's outlined is very, very small. It's for the external security of the nation, so that the borders of the nation, to keep peace within the nation, to provide the people with justice. That's almost it. And its function is very negative, very coercive. It deals with problems, but it's basically very limited, very small. Whereas the modern states, the modern Western states, they've appropriated more and more power to themselves. And when they get involved, this is the thing: when states get involved in this, if you like, being the when they get involved in education, or they get involved in health, or they get involved in trying to promote all these things that people consider social goods, then the problem is this is what the the reformers, the people that became independents and then then became separatists, their their progression in their thinking, they realized that as soon as you allow and give the state, if you like, allow the state to become, say, the moral arbiter of good, and to take the place of, if you like, take the place of God, they become tyrants. They always become tyrannical, and they always end up oppressing different groups. Even if you got this love, this it sounds really nice, doesn't it? The people, even even in 20th century arguments within reformed seminaries, people talk about that that it's legitimate for the state to have the the interests of the common good of the whole of society as one of its goals. It's ascribing to the state something that is outside of its scriptural, the way it's been circumscribed within scripture, with a very small, because if you allow the state to the bureaucracies to grow and to support all these different functions, that it becomes tyrannical. And that's what's happened with our modern states. They are becoming more and more tyrannical. So really, so that is why, just from the point of view of sort of like of history and of actually studying what happens in practice, the state is supposed to have a very small, distinct sphere, and all the other spheres of life are supposed to be, the artistic, the humanities, the music, the science. They've got their own principles and everything there, and in it's the society, the interaction of us together and the society together. It's not the state is not to, in the sense, to be the arbiter and the controller of all those different spheres. They're supposed to be in sort of like an equal relationship and the society, in the sense, is organic and coming out of the interaction of these different spheres. It's not, it's not, we're not a top down. Socialism is always top down, and socialism has always led to tyranny. But the 20th century shows us that the operation, the operation of the states during the COVID pandemic, tyrannical. If we rely on states and rely on government to do these things, they'll do it to us rather than for us. So sort of trying to ground this and trying to come down to earth. I started off, we're starting off talking about states as legitimate. Romans 13 tells us that states are legitimate, but it gives a very clear boundaries that the states that we're in they are respect for the institutions of the state, the institutions of government, the authorities above us, is because God has instituted those offices. But those offices are to do good, and to reward good, and to defend good, and to punish evildoers. Very, very limited, you see. The scope of the state is considered to be very, very limited, very circumscribed, very limited. And that our attitude to the state is not to be one of, it's to be a positive, and we're to be the best citizens we can possibly be. But in a sense, it's a reasoned and it's a critical submission to them. Submission is a critical thing. It says we submit one to another. So we don't. It doesn't say obey. It's a different word. Lloyd Jones brings out the way. It's not obeying one another. it's submitting to one another, it's giving people space, it's giving them the benefit of the doubt. It's very much referring to a psychological attitude, but it's not to say to give we respect our leaders, we respect their office, we are as accommodating as we can possibly be, but we have to assess what they're doing against the scriptural principles, and when they step outside of their jurisdiction, we have every right, both in the sense of being citizens within the laws of the different nations that we're in, to exercise our own rights as citizens, and to resist what's going on if we believe this is incorrect. What's happening in our societies, we've got every right to do that. And in the extreme, we've got every right to join movements and even revolutionary movements that evict a corrupt state. We do not just have to passively endure and ignore what's going on, and always be supportive of what the government does. We can be, there's a whole graduation of different resistance, because you can imagine being in situations where, yes, you're not being actively subversive in the sense you're trying to work against the government, but you are being critical, and you're being whether in debates or in articles or whatever you're doing, however it might manifest you're not going to argue for violent civil disorder, and in order to try and get you're on the side of law and order, but nevertheless you are arguing, and you're agitating, and it may, if that doesn't bring change, and then there is scope, and this is Lloyd George makes this clear. This is not an extremist position. It's perfectly clear that if a state delegitimizes itself because it's not behaving in accordance with Romans 13, then you are free to join revolutionary movements that will overthrow that state. So gosh. So there's probably another, yes, I probably managed to, all in all, I managed probably 3 hours of that. But I think it's really important to get, I've written so much more about this in it's not it's I there's so much more to this and so much more detail that can go into, but what I wanted to try and do with this is to grab your attention, that yes, obviously I want you to go, and yes, all right, we want to read this in the book, we want to read the chapter in the book, and I want you to read the extended study, which I'm not sure if they're they're at the moment, they're sort of like just part of my website, part of blogs, but these are extensive, these are big. I'm not sure if they can ever get to the point where they can be books in their own right, but I might be able to self-publish those or something, do something with them. But I'll see. I'll have to reread them again, because both some of the stuff, I don't think, not quite so sure how a publisher would be that, but I'm sure maybe something on politics, state, and because there's some bits, I was particularly dealing with the Trump dimension in that as well, of how people reacted, but it took, there's so much more detail in those studies to to get us beyond this what I would call infantile view that that our only obligation is to be completely obedient to what our government says. If our government says that you can't go outside, a government hasn't got any right to say to citizens you can't go outside. The government can advise, and it can say, give us reasons as to why we shouldn't go outside, but if we want to go outside, in the end we haven't got any. The law of the land actually explicitly says that the government can't do that to us, and there's the law of the land, the Acts of Parliament. That's the interesting thing about the British Constitution, in a sense, is that the people often talk about, the British Constitution is not written. Well, actually it is. The law of the land is the Magna Carta. The Magna Carta basically says to the government, gives you very strict boundaries, and that's why the whole British jurisprudence, they talk about the bar and the dock and everything, and that's called the law of the sea, because we already have a law of the land, and the law of the land says that the government can't restrict my freedom of and cannot tell me and cannot restrict my freedom of travel, my freedom to conduct my business on the we are, the government cannot tell me that I'm not free to conduct my business in the way I want to conduct my business, as long as it's not criminal. That's what the, in a sense, the Magna Carta is, the common law, what's called the common law, the British common law, which which became the inspiration for the common law in lots of European nations and in the US. The idea of English common law. So this sort of like idea that that somehow, because an act of parliament, the original function of a jury was to judge the law. The judge was not the most important person in the court. That's the interesting thing about the court. We think of the court now. The court was the court of the commoners, who were then, if Parliament had passed a law, the court of the commoners evaluated the law and tested the law. That's a remarkable thing. Originally that was what was. People just don't realise that. That the the judge, in the sense, was supposed to be the public servant. They're not the public serve the judges and to serve there's all this stuff that's been glossed over, that that we have certain rights that are granted to us before God. And that's one of the great things about the American Constitution. The founders, they really tried to make that very, very explicit, what was implicit in our system there, and easily covered over, and in a sense the US has had to fight this battle with the administrative state and the bureaucratic state and the Chevron deference, which basically created the bureaucratic state. And that's what's so interesting, and what's going on in the US at the moment with the re-election of Trump, and this an understanding, they are understanding how a state, because the last, regardless of where you sit politically, what actually happened in the US in the last 4 years, and the legal lawfare, the assassination attempts, that shows you what happens to a state when a state becomes tyrannical and it begins to use the processes of law to go against its own political opponents. And that's why one of the things why the whole emphasis within scripture is on a small state with a very limited scope and a limited jurisdiction as to what it should do, being concerned with national defense, being concerned with our borders, being concerned with ensuring that justice is available to all, that people can resolve their differences. That's so that was it's a great cautionary tale, what's happened in the US over the last 4 years, and we're fighting. I think we're in the point where we're beginning to fight in the UK, understand it in the UK, because we've not had a even though our Conservative Party was considered conservative, it's basically been another socialist party. It's just been more, it still believes in big government, state involved with everything. We've never really had any who's really who really wants to challenge the status quo and undo a lot of the government just becoming bigger and the state becoming bigger and bigger and bigger. Now we are seeing some of that stuff with people become wise to that, and we'll see where where our politics goes. But we're seeing some of the very, very oppressive stuff within the EU of trying to deal with freedom of speech and labeling stuff hate speech, any speech that any community, it's using those terms of malinformation, misinformation, disinformation, all with the view of trying to control what people can say, what they can think, and to manage this, and it becomes tyrannical when you make the state the arbiter, and you give the state, and you say that the state can decide what is misinformation, malinformation, disinformation, or what is hate speech. if you give the state that sort of power, then that's the end of your civilization. That's you're into tyranny, and that's why, in the sense of the American Constitution, that freedom of speech was the first thing that the founders put in there, and then they put the Second Amendment, which was and the and the citizen can must be able to arm themselves to defend themselves against the government. So that's how important it was. That First Amendment is guaranteed by the Second. Okay, so yeah, so I think covered a lot of ground, and I think I will enjoy listening to this myself as I edit it and chop this up. Maybe a couple of bits I need to chop out, but these are sort of meant to be talks. They're not lectures, and they're not, they're meant to just be pushing ideas out there and saying, yes, this is my other work. I want you to read my other work. I want you to read the book when the book comes out. With the publishers past it. They apparently it takes them about 6 or 7 months to edit the book. I thought, that's the way publishers work. So but I want I want this to helping people to think, helping people to get to learn, to get their own relationship to to the different issues, and this is a big issue, the issue of the state and I'm sure some of the stuff here, I've looked at it from a Christian perspective and the implications for Christians, but this, you can see just with some of those how important it is, not just for Christians. This is important for us culturally. If we make the state Lord and Master, the state will be Lord and Master. It will. If we don't consider our rights, if we consider that the government is the source of our rights, then there's nothing absolute about those rights, but they're all relative. Then the government can take away those rights if it judges so. So that's why this issue is such an important issue. Okay, so God bless you. I will see you again, and we'll progress. Goodbye.